Hello and welcome to episode 12 of React Native Radio. Today on our show, we have Kevin Old.
Hey, everyone.
I'm Nader Davitt, and our special guest today is Adam Miskiewicz.
Hi there. Happy to be here.
We're going to be kind of discussing as our topic React Native in production. Adam's had quite a bit of experience working with React Native, even though it's still fairly a new framework. He's built quite a few apps in it. So before we get going into the topic, though, can you give us a quick background about yourself, how you got into development?
Sure. So I am currently the interactive director at an agency in Baltimore called Chalk and Chisel. I founded it with three other partners about 4.5 years ago or so now. We focus mostly on web and mobile development. And so that's kind of, how I got the chance to use React and then eventually use React Native. And being the interactive director, they were nice and they let me choose all of our technologies that we use. So I was able to kind of shove those down the throats of all of my developers that work with me. But yeah, so prior to that, I worked in an agency called Just 3. And then prior to that, I worked at an agency in Anaheim, California, called Level 2 Designs. That's where I got my start. I've been programming, since I was like 6 years old. Started with learning BASIC on this like VTech laptop. And in high school, especially, I spent a lot of time kind of working with the internal tech team at my high school and like building like small little web apps for them back in the ASP classic days. My first year of college is when I got that job at Level 2 and just continued to do web development, both front end and back end. Honestly, back then, I would say I was probably doing a lot more back end than I was front end. We worked with a lot of like small clients back then, no one like too crazy. But then when I got to a chance to work at Just 3, they were kind of like this crazy awesome agency. They were doing work with Nike and American Express and Foursquare. And so it was just me and one of my now business partners, Ben Slavin, working on that team for a lot of it. Some developers came and went, on different projects, but for the most part, we were the two full-time people. So we were doing some crazy stuff and did like talk about being thrown into the deep end. So I definitely like credit that experience and like really like kickstarting my thinking like an engineer part of my life, because we were forced with some pretty hard problems that, honestly, many people never get to solve. So I feel really lucky to have worked on some of that stuff. And then when we decided to start our own agency, we kind of like started as a dev shop. So I was still doing a lot of front end and back end development. But, we kind of immediately started getting into doing mobile. And that this was, 5 years ago now. So we were talking about, doing completely native iOS development. I remember building my first iOS app, not having any clue what I was doing for the Livestrong Foundation.
That must have been fun.
Oh, yeah. That was a crazy experience. And it was on a short timeline, too, because it's an agency and everything's on a short timeline. But I ended up really liking that, actually. And we continued to do more work on that app, which was like it was called the Livestrong Cancer Guide and Tracker. And it had a lot of like custom UI on it and everything. To be honest with you, it still runs today. It's an iPad app, and it hasn't been updated in years, like 3.5 years or so, and it still runs. And it actually is not all that bad. It actually runs pretty good now that it's like not on old iPad hardware. I remember like part of the app was like a PDF viewer, and that was back before like you could just like download a PDF viewer and stick it into a native iOS app like you can now. And so I wrote like this custom PDF viewer on top of like core animation layers and things like that. And I remember like rewriting it like 8 times because like just like the memory, there was only, I don't know, 512 megs of memory or something on the original iPad, and it most of it was used by the operating system, and so it didn't leave like a lot for loading these big, beautiful pages in this like carefully designed Livestrong cancer guide PDF, and so I remember writing it 8 times. But when I loaded the app up not too long ago, maybe a couple months ago, on the newest iPad, man, it just flew. It was great.
Nice. Yeah, absolutely.
I felt really proud there for a minute after remembering like how just awful that was back in the day. So just a lot of web development, a lot of mobile development, a lot of back-end development, and that's like it's all just kind of been a blur over the past 4.5 years. But honestly, really over the past like 8 years, I've worked on so many things. Like it's the crazy part about working at an agency. It's like a new project every month. So
yeah, you get a lot of good experience, I'm sure, doing all types of different stuff, huh?
Absolutely. So we work on apps that have a pretty like wide variety. So we've done everything from kind of content-based websites, right? That still have a bit of interactivity, but obviously like back-end requirements and things for something like that is a lot different than like building a back-end. One of the mobile apps we're working on right now that's actually built in React Native is a mobile restaurant payment application. So you can go into a restaurant and you type in your table number and it pulls the check information down from the point of sale system and all of that. So building a back end like that is just that's like integrating with a legacy point of sale and like doing all this crazy stuff. Like that is just so much different than building some, like, for instance, we worked on livestrong.org, and there's complexity in that as well, trust me, but like it's just such a different problem to solve. So it's definitely, I've had to learn to be like super adaptable over the years.
So Adam, have you guys done any hybrid development there at your company, or has it been strictly native and React Native?
Yeah, so honestly, we really never did dive into the hybrid mobile app development. So that actually, I think, gave kind of an interesting perspective as we started moving into to using React Native. We never really dealt with the craziness of like working with Cordova or Appcelerator or anything like that. I think I played with Titanium like once a long time ago. Actually, we did build one thing in it a long time ago. It was for NASA. But we really have always focused on, so doing web development and then native mobile development. And we always were strictly doing iOS stuff as well. So because of that, I had native mobile app development experience. And then our other mobile developer, Mark, who I'm sure many people have read his blog post about switching from native mobile development to React Native. We both definitely had a kind of deep experience with building native apps. And so like when we started considering, basically when I started, considering to use React Native and then like talking to Mark about it and working with him on it, I had a little bit of an advantage because I'd also done a lot of web development before, so obviously there's a lot of similarities, right, between doing React Native development and like normal React development on the web. But he, came from this background of really always, like, he was a Windows developer before he came and worked with us, and then he was doing, native iOS stuff. So he's used to Xcode and his IDE and like things that actually work. Whereas like on the web, like we're used to like, Java, a JavaScript ecosystem that, changes with the wind and, new packagers every single day. So like, his tolerance for all of that, it was actually a really eye-opening experience for me when we started using React Native. It's like his tolerance for that was so low. And to be honest, thinking back on it, he probably had it right. Like why should we be tolerant of the craziness that occurs in the JavaScript ecosystem? And so like I appreciate the fact that Facebook and kind of kind of surrounding community that is formed around React and React Native, even though like something like React Native is still kind of in its infancy, there's still a lot of care around the developer experience, right? And so, I think a lot of other places in the JavaScript ecosystem, they don't care as much about that, or they at least don't seem to. And so I think it's really great to see that focus by both the internal teams and the community teams, because it coming from the native world, it's definitely like a eye-opening experience to like come into JavaScript and not know what the hell is going on.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point of view coming from someone that's done a lot of native development and then that's gone right into React Native without kind of doing the whole hybrid thing that most of us have been doing as web developers, trying to build mobile apps.
Absolutely. It was definitely rough at first. He talks, I won't like read his blog post to you. He talks about this quite a bit. I'm sure we can link to it in like the show notes or something, since I've referenced it a few times now. But he, definitely, it was definitely rough at the beginning, but he came out of it, I think, and I'm kind of proud of this, looking at him as somebody who I work with every day. Like he really came out of it with a whole different appreciation of programming in general, I think. And just really thinking about, when you're doing native development, it's like, well, Apple has prescribed this way of doing everything for the most part. You know what I mean? Like, there's not a single thing that you can't find in the Apple documentation about how to do something on iOS. I mean, you can almost find out anything. But, when you come into the like wild west of web development, and then the even wilder west of React Native, it's just a whole different beast. And but I think it's a good thing at the end of the day. I think that it really made him put his engineering hat on and really start to dive in. And so it's been cool seeing that. And it's not just him on my team either. I have several other people that work on my team that are web developers who have also now gotten to do a lot of React Native development. There's a bunch of benefits about it, but it's from a personal benefit perspective. I think it's really cool that they can meaningfully contribute to, really good, solid mobile applications using the same skill set that they had, that they have for web. So I think, you definitely look at it from both angles, and they're both so completely different. But I think, and I probably wouldn't have necessarily said this back when React Native was first released, but actually using it and actually spending, we've been working with it solidly for about 6 months now, maybe a little over that, like seeing people come at it from these different perspectives, but still all at the end of the day, really enjoy using it and really enjoying, the productivity that it brings them after they get over that initial learning curve and that initial barrier. It's really been cool to see.
Awesome. So I know that you just mentioned 6 months that you guys had been actively working on it, but yourself and the gentleman that wrote the blog post, how long have you guys been using React Native? I know that you had access to it early because I did as well, and we met at ReactConf, and they gave us the alpha access, and I think all of us wanted to jump in, and I had other things come up, but you're probably the only person I know that jumped in head first. So were you guys actively building right out of the gate?
Kinda, not really, but kind of. Like we definitely started playing with it immediately. I think the day it was released, I was at React.js Conf and got a little sample app running and stuff like that and started playing with all of that. I would say we probably didn't start using it seriously for probably a couple months. We started building an app that ended up getting put on hold, which was actually a kind of a blessing because we ended up building part of that app, and that was Mark and I's both first foray into using React Native and getting used to what this is going to be, and then he like we ended up having to stop building that app for various reasons. But then it was like perfect timing because that's when we got the Discovery VR contract and were able to start working on that. And, you know, we ended up working on Discovery VR we really did it relatively quickly. I mean, we built that whole app, you know, in like 2.5 months or so. I think being able to, looking back on it, I think 2.5 months would have been like impossible to build something as polished as that ended up turning out being, you know, doing it fully native. And at the same time, like Mark learned Android development for that app, which was pretty crazy. So like this was even before this was, unfortunately, React Native for Android did not come out in time for us to build Discovery VR on React Native for Android. So we were building a React Native version for iOS and a native Java version simultaneously. And we did that in like 2.5 months.
I didn't know you guys did that app. That app is awesome, by the way. Good job.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so let's could we talk a little bit about that app and the specifics of it? So I know that it's using the native virtual reality. Is that correct? And you just guys built a bridge over to it?
Yeah. So the player is actually built by this company called Little Star. They have like their primary business is like a virtual reality. Like a basically like a YouTube for virtual reality, but they kind of got this license deal with Discovery and ended up being able to license us their player, and then Discovery's team was working on the design for this app. You know, they had this concept, and we were kind of working on it with them a little bit. And they were like, well, we really want to build this app. And and we were like, okay. And then they were like, we need this done by like the end of August. And this was in, you know, early to mid June. And we're like, okay. And so, you know, once we realized that we didn't have to build the player from scratch, which honestly, the player itself is not like super complicated. Like you can imagine that the video itself is basically just like kind of a panoramic thing. You know, kind of there's a lot of work that goes in post-production to actually generating the virtual reality video. But once you have the video, displaying it in virtual reality is generally like projecting it on the inner side of a sphere. So it's really like if you're even remotely familiar with 3D programming, it's a relatively simple type of thing. Obviously, there's some complexity in getting the gyroscope to work and all of that stuff. But for the most part, you know, we definitely could have built it had we had the time. But it was definitely great to be able to leverage, you know, Little Star's player that already existed, but then be able to focus on the user experience, which is really what we were really caring about. And being able to do that in React Native and be able to build it relatively quickly and be able to do the animations and stuff that are in it. You know, we use React Motion. So, you know, for those people that know React on the web, you know, React Motion is really awesome. I think I don't remember when it was released, but it really wasn't released too long before we started working on Discovery VR. And that just like worked on React Native. It was awesome. It was really great. And so like all the animations that you see for the most part are all done using React Motion. So yeah, so it's a everything in the app that you see, all of the UI is React Native except for the player itself, which is a bridged native component.
That's awesome. So did you guys run into any issues when you went to deploy that to the App Store?
Honestly, not really. I think if I were to talk about like App Store stuff, you know, like working with the iOS App Store is not really that great of an experience. Like it's a pain. You have to deal with provisioning profiles and certificates, and you have to, you know, then you upload your build to the App Store. You hope that it gets approved. If it doesn't get approved, you have to figure out how to deal with it not being approved. And like, you know, there's definitely a lot of pain points there. But I think we at Chalk and Chisel were lucky because it wasn't our first app that we deployed to the App Store. So like, it's hard for me to really directly know how that would be for a beginner. On the same token, I know like the problems that we fought with over the years, they really have not changed very much from like what it was like deploying to the App Store like 3 years ago. Like really, it has not been, that great of an experience. But in my opinion, React Native actually makes this whole thing, like, I think that there's potential in like the next 3 months or so, maybe 3 to 6 months, like for the React Native community to like fix this whole problem, because you can deploy code, without submitting through the App Store again. As long as there's an explicit clause in the iOS App Store, the App Store rules. I'll have to think about what it is, but there's an explicit clause there that says as long as the JavaScript that you're remotely deploying to the app is running in JavaScript core that's built into the operating system, and you're not drastically changing the functionality of the app, that it's actually explicitly allowed. So like, I think that, using something like App Hub or CodeShip, and then, you can build like a continuous integration and deployment pipeline with that, because all of these things are like command line tools for the most part, and you can just take your code and deploy it using these things. You could do a whole like continuous deployment solution for a mobile app, which is just like, there's only like, the only people that have figured that type of stuff out is like Facebook, who deploys a new version of their mobile app every 2 weeks. You know what I mean? Like this is it, but for companies that don't have the resources that like Facebook does, for instance, doing that whole thing would be just a huge process. But React Native actually makes that, in my opinion, a lot more approachable.
Right. So would you say that it's comparable to deploying one of the wrapper apps to the App Store?
You mean like a hybrid app?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
Yeah. It's a little bit different because you still have to, like with the wrapper apps, like if you're doing like a Titanium thing, like most of your, like when you deploy it to the App Store, the Titanium, the Appcelerator people have already like cared about any of the code that may potentially get your app rejected from a code perspective. There's like two reasons why your app could get rejected. One is that you're doing something that Apple doesn't like from a code perspective, and then the other reason is that you're just providing such a bad user experience that it's like app or something that goes against like Apple's guidelines that Apple doesn't want to release your app. But from the code side of things, like Cordova, Titanium, like there's been hundreds of apps shipped to the store with those frameworks. So, you kind of like just assume that it's going to work. With React Native, you still do have to care a little bit because there's probably nothing in React Native that's going to get you rejected explicitly, but something that like beginners don't think about. There's this one piece when you're submitting to the App Store that asks about whether or not you're using the advertising identifier, which is like a unique identifier that's assigned to each app that you can access to like serve ads and use Google Analytics and stuff like that. And if you were to include like Google Analytics, the iOS SDK in your application, like it's going to like automatically require this module that Apple explicitly checks for, which is this advertising identifier module. And if you don't check the box when you're submitting to the App Store that like you're using or not using the advertising identifier, like your app can just be rejected and they don't tell you until the app's already rejected. So like, there are like little things like that. Granted, there's resources for this on the internet. Like, I'm not saying like this is all just like crazy institutional knowledge, because I think like there are definitely places to find this information. But I guess my broad advice would be like, if you're a web developer and you have found React Native and you've built something really, really awesome and you're ready to ship it to the store, just make sure you've done your homework about, the things required to double check before you go to the App Store and then go from there. Because you have to remember that at the end of the day, you're still really deploying a native application. It's, even though you're running JavaScript, it's still, making native things. So you have to care about those things.
I have a question about how you guys have been dealing with things like data and authentication. But I guess first, I'll ask you about your data. I guess a couple of things. One of them would be, what data architecture are you guys using? And also, what backend have you guys found that works good with some of your apps with React Native? I know it could vary, but just overall, if you can go into some of your experience there.
Sure. With the exception of Discovery VR, the other three applications that I'm working on in React Native all use Relay and GraphQL. So on the first app that we started using Relay and GraphQL on, it was a really funny story, actually. I was working with my friend Tim Greiser. He wrote Connects and Bookshelf, by the way. So he's a pretty great back-end Node developer, but also does a lot of React stuff as well. And so I contracted him on this project, and we were talking, and GraphQL was already out, but Relay wasn't out yet. So we really wanted to use GraphQL for the back end for this app. Kind of maybe we were writing a Redux wrapper around GraphQL, kind of like a not super well thought out one, but just one that would kind of get us through until Relay came out. And then just literally the day we were starting to write that for this app, Relay came out. So we dropped everything, and because we're crazy, and decided to go all in on Relay and GraphQL. And, we quickly learned that it was not going to be an easy task. Getting Relay working with React Native, even the application building it all was actually a really huge pain, because React, whereas on the web you have React and React DOM now with React 14, React Native is still not deep down it's based on React 0.14, but it's not separated out like React and React DOM are. So you can't just require React and expect things to work. And so since Relay is built on top of this React 0.14 infrastructure, it definitely does not work out of the box with React Native. There's a huge issue that I've commented on 50 times, trying to help people through this problem, because I've done it 3 times now on the Relay repo. So that was kind of a crazy experience. But once we got it working, it is, I can say without a doubt, the best development experience that you can even imagine. I think that I've done the REST API stuff. I've done very complex REST APIs. I've done ad hoc endpoints. I've been through all that stuff. Like I said earlier, there's, we worked on so many different types of applications that I've seen a lot of the bad parts, the good parts and the bad parts, I guess, of backend programming, at least on a small to medium scale. And so with Relay and GraphQL, it's just all of those things, it all just fades into the background. GraphQL so strictly speaking on the back end side of things, GraphQL is so incredibly well thought out. You can tell that the people at Facebook that worked on that, Lee Byron and his team, they just are incredibly intelligent and they do amazing work. And just the sheer design and architecture that's behind GraphQL as a language, and then thinking about it as a backend architecture, it's just so good. And then when you couple that with Relay on the front end, and then especially Relay on the front end with a mobile application, it's, I don't know, it's hard for me to explain how awesome it is. And especially when things just work, and at first you're like, well, how the hell did it even do that? Because, Relay is pretty complicated, and so is GraphQL. It's definitely not like super easy. Like it's not a 3-day project to like wrap your head around that whole system. Like it's pretty involved. But once you understand like what it's doing, and especially once you've used it enough that you can start to really take advantage of the crazy stuff it's doing behind the scenes, like it's so solid. And like there's definitely a lot of work left on both of those technologies. And then obviously, I already talked about how like horrifying it was to get it integrated with React Native. It's another one of those like look 6 months down the road thing, and like it will, like I can't imagine building an app any other way. Honestly, even today, I can't imagine building an app any other way. It's just too good.
So
wow, that's awesome.
So you say it takes quite a bit of time to kind of wrap your head around it. Having said that, can you give us like a 5-minute introduction to what it is?
Sure. Yeah,
I mean, yeah. I know we're not going to be able to go into all the details, but maybe a few people that are listening haven't really heard or see. I've heard, but I still haven't actually had a chance to sit down and work with it. But the more I hear people explain it, the more I kind of am able to wrap my head around it.
So like starting with GraphQL. So GraphQL is basically a way to structure your data endpoints. Well, with GraphQL, there's only a single data endpoint versus like structuring them with a traditional like REST-based approach. So with REST, everything is based on a resource. If you're fetching a story, like you're going to go, API/stories/the ID, and then you're fetching comments for the story. So you're going to do, there's several ways to approach that in REST. You could do API/story/the ID for the story/comments, or you could do, comments or API/comments and then like a story ID and get like all the comments for the story. There's a bunch of different ways to do it, but when all is said and done, like the client is responsible for going out to a bunch of different endpoints and taking all that data, making sure it's fetched in a fast manner and coalescing it all together on the client. I think most people have realized over time that that's really hard to do well. And so, when your back end gets sufficiently complicated enough, and you start to introduce caching and that type of thing, like you often end up creating these like ad hoc endpoints. Like I can remember an app that I built with my team a long time ago, where one of the main things about this app was that like most data in the app was related to the user profile, and so there's all these different data types, but I wasn't about to go make 50 requests to the server in order to fetch all these different data types and associate them with this profile on the client. Like I remember on the back end, we had basically a single profile endpoint that you could like pass different arguments to. And, it was like this basically not RESTful version at all of REST. And we were dealing with, how to cache this information and like make this request really fast. And I don't know, there's all these crazy problems. So, I feel like most people who have a sufficiently complex backend like run into that issue, that REST just like kind of doesn't do it for them. After a while, it makes it very difficult to work with that data on the front end. And then they realize that they end up needing to create all these ad hoc endpoints anyway. So what GraphQL does is it defines this language, this query language that is not like a backend query language, but it's not like how to query your database or anything like that. It's just how to query your application, essentially. So you define a schema, and it's a typed schema. So you define all your data types, and then each of those data types can be resolved. And that the beauty of GraphQL is that it doesn't couple you to a database of any kind. Like people hear graph and QL and they're like, oh, do I have to use a graph database? Well, no, you don't have to do any of that. You can actually put GraphQL on top of a REST API and get all of the benefits of GraphQL and probably actually see performance improvements, while what it's actually doing is just talking to a REST API. And actually, if you look at the Relay and GraphQL example, they're doing that with the Star Wars API. You can see all this code that they've written to interface with the Star Wars API. So that's kind of GraphQL in like a super nutshell. It does a lot of awesome things. It also handles mutations. I think that's an important piece of that. It's not just querying, but it's also changing your data. But then Relay is kind of the React-y way to interact with that data on the client. And so the kind of main goal of Relay is to be able to define your data needs with your components in a declarative fashion. So basically, all the goodness that we have in writing React apps, like it just became way better because now we can think about our data the same way we think about our UI, essentially. And because GraphQL allows you to build these really rich schemas, the data that you're fetching in Relay and the way that you're writing your queries to query your GraphQL endpoint in Relay really allows you don't have to think so much about, do I need to fetch this endpoint or this endpoint? And like, how do I put these two pieces of data together? Like, you can just query that. And presuming, you've written your GraphQL backend in kind of an idiomatic way, it will just work.
And how is the data available? Is it available as like state?
Sorry, as what?
Is it available in the state of the component? Is that how
it gets passed into the component as props? Yep. So you define fragments, which is a GraphQL speak for like a piece of a query. You define fragments on your components, and basically Relay figures out how to join all of those queries together. They all get sent to the server at once. So if you had a relatively complex. Actually, a really good example is usually like a profile screen. So you have things like a first name and a last name, and you have an avatar, and then maybe you have like an activity stream. So like usually you'd make like 5 separate requests or something for that one screen. But with Relay, you can say for each of those components, and if you're familiar with React, which hopefully you are if you're listening to this podcast, you can imagine how you'd structure that application, and you can define your data needs for the avatar, for the name component, for the activity list, and then the activity list item. You can define your needs of that data right on those components. And then as soon as you basically hit run in your application, and you go to that page, Relay is going to figure out how to put all those things together and send those all off to the server in one round trip and get that data back.
And how is the server or the database normally set up to handle this request? Is it a RESTful request to a big data set, and then the data set gets passed down, and then GraphQL deals with it, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it basically can be the short answer is it can be pretty much whatever you want. The longer answer is that based on each type. So if you imagine you have a user type, you would define how that user gets resolved. So if that say you had like kind of a microservice architecture, and you needed to pull your users from your user service, right? You could just make that web request to your user service in the resolve function in GraphQL.js for the user type, and as long as it returns data that looks like your schema, it will just work. The resolve function lets you return a promise. Or if you have something a little bit less complicated, that resolve function could just go to your Mongo database, or it could go to your Postgres database and get that information. And then, so that's like in its most simple case. But then if you have something a bit more complicated where you kind of need to avoid this, like the kind of classic like n+1 query problem, if you're using language like Node, for instance, because of its awesome event loop. You can just wait for like you can basically put a kind of a middleware in with the GraphQL resolver and allow for, say you're fetching, I don't know, 100 stories, right? And then each of those has like comments, and then, and they have like people that commented on those stories. And so like you could just go crazy with this query, but you could imagine that in your resolve functions, you're sending those off to like this, basically a query aggregator. It figures out how to make the most efficient query to your database and then return that back through GraphQL. And luckily, you don't have to even write that yourself, because Facebook has open sourced that as well, and it's called Data Loader. Data Loader might not work for like the most complex applications, but you can use it for pretty complex applications, and it will kind of solve that M+1 problem for you, which is something that a lot of people, when they first look at GraphQL and they see that you can kind of like, the client can like just request whatever data it wants. That's kind of the first thing that any like self-respecting backend programmer is going to worry about. Like, oh God, what's it going to do to my database? But the simple answer is that it's actually a really simple problem to solve.
I guess one other thing I did have a question about. As far as authentication is concerned, can you give us a brief overview of how you've handled that so far?
Yeah. So a lot of mobile apps, they have social authentication. So Facebook has actually provided a React Native library for dealing with Facebook login and Facebook sharing and things like that. So that's been really cool. And then Twitter, you don't have the same thing for Twitter, but it's relatively easy to bridge components. I think it's important to note that like people shouldn't be scared of bridging components if they don't have like Objective-C knowledge. Like I think that Facebook has done a really good job in React Native of both documenting, both in code and in like actual docs, and providing like these really great little macros for Objective-C to make bridging components really simple, at least when they're simple components. And so actually building the bridge to allow for integration with the Twitter SDK is really only like 20 lines of code or something like that. So it's really pretty simple to make that work. And then, like I said, we use Relay for everything. So there's actually, kind of the story around authentication for Relay. There's kind of two different schools of thought. One is that you do your authentication using kind of a more traditional model, maybe using OAuth or something like that, and keep your GraphQL endpoint behind like an authenticated, you need an authenticated token or something like that to access it. And then so that Relay is actually not worrying about any of the authentication at all. You're doing that kind of the more traditional way. Although recently I've been playing with the idea of actually doing things like user registration and getting an authentication token and things like that using Relay and GraphQL mutations. And it's actually been working really well. I wouldn't recommend that for like a beginner who's just getting started in GraphQL and Relay, because I think it's a little bit, you have to be kind of familiar with the internals of Relay and GraphQL to understand like how that would even work. But I hope that's something I can open source actually after I battle test it a little bit to make it a little bit easier to get authentication integrated with Relay and GraphQL, because I know it's a question a lot of people have pretty constantly. But from a pure React Native side of things, I think that the biggest thing that I struggled with when thinking about authentication on a mobile application versus authentication on the web is, you can't think in terms of, it really depends on where your experience is. But if you come from just like kind of a traditional, like you're using a web framework of some kind to deal with authentication, and like that's just what you're used to, doing mobile authentication is quite different, because you don't usually use sessions. You need to do like maybe a JSON web token is a really great way to deal with mobile authentication. So, if you're not familiar with that, that's something to like look up and to really consider using from a mobile side of things, because it's really easy to work with. And you just have to think about the fact that you're not in a browser. So there's just different considerations that you normally wouldn't have to even care about if you were just doing kind of normal web programming.
So how is the backend deployed? What are you guys using server-wise to host this?
We used to use Heroku for pretty much everything. But as time has gone on, we've kind of gotten into the whole Docker thing. And we've also realized that Heroku is quite expensive for a lot of our clients. I think we have some clients that are paying, like $1,500 a month to like, because of all the services and things that is necessary, like when you use Heroku. When it really, if it all came down to it, we probably could host it on AWS or on Google Cloud or something for probably 20% of that cost. So as we've gotten into this whole Docker thing, I've been like a huge fan of Google Cloud Platform, and specifically the Google Container Engine, which runs on top of something called Kubernetes, which is a container scheduler. And that's been, from a DevOps perspective, that's been a kind of an exciting thing to work on. Feels very cutting edge when you're talking about these things. I actually just saw Pete Hunt tweeted that he at his startup, he just deployed something, his first service using Rust and on top of RocksDB, and it's deployed using Docker and Kubernetes. I was like, that's the most like cutting edge tweet I've ever seen. But it is really great. I mean, I kid, but it's kind of lets you build like your whole like your own personal Heroku. I mean, it's really kind of cool. And I've written, I've focused a lot more as I've been doing that. We've focused a lot more on doing continuous integration and deployment. And so, you write some scripts, take you a couple days to write, and then like you're pretty much set. And, you get push and it does all your things on Circle CI and deploys it to a cluster of machines up in the cloud somewhere. And it's really pretty cool. And you're not paying like Heroku premiums. I should be clear, though, there's really nothing all that special about like hosting a GraphQL backend. Like you just use Express or Happy. In fact, there's a GraphQL Express like middleware that's on the GraphQL GitHub, and it really just all ties together really nicely. I mean, you could pretty much host it anywhere. Mm-hmm. But from a scaling perspective, I like to host stuff on infrastructure that I know that like as our client demands more features and things of that nature, that we're going to be able to scale with them. And so, that's kind of why I've chosen that. And then it's actually good because we have a client that we're working with right now that requires that all of their infrastructure be hosted on Microsoft Azure. And so without having the experience with like Docker and Kubernetes, I think we would have been a little bit lost, getting started on Azure without like having some underpinning to like tie it in with the other type of architectures that we use for our backend. So, because on Azure, we're able to just deploy a Kubernetes cluster and deal with it just like we would on AWS or on Google Cloud. And it all just kind of works because it's kind of cloud agnostic.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up, but I've lost my train of thought. So,
okay.
Sorry. I was thinking about all that awesomeness going on.
I know, I was too.
I mean, it's because I totally, yeah.
I'm fascinated by the GraphQL stuff. I can't wait to actually get into it. I'll need to do that over the holiday, maybe.
So, what do you guys use as far as load balancing? Do you round robin? Do you have a separate caching layer in front of your database that or API that the relay endpoint hits?
No, right now we've really just been we've just been talking directly from GraphQL to our database, and that's perfectly fine. Like I think that a lot of people are going to do that. because GraphQL is just it ends up being one thing that was like not expected for me was like how GraphQL is just a really great way to like architect your backend code. So like originally I was thinking, well, yeah, I'll just like write the backend like how I normally would write the backend and like throw GraphQL on top of it. When you really get used to using it, what ends up happening is you really it really goes the other way. You really start to deeply integrate GraphQL into like how you're thinking about architecting your application. And I think that actually ends up serving you really well later on. If you did want to add a caching layer between, GraphQL and your database, it really would be super trivial, because if you've written your application in a way that like you really kind of bought into this GraphQL like typed approach, and where, like I mentioned, like you're setting up resolvers for your types and things like that, your schema and like all of the code that is around your schema, and then anything from a front end side of things, none of that even needs to be touched, because GraphQL is so much about like what data does my front end need in order to to actually work, right? So however GraphQL ends up getting that data and wherever it ends up coming from, like it can kind of be completely transparent to like this GraphQL layer, and then super transparent to your client and to your relay layer. So I think that like when I really think about it, it's like, even though right now most of our backends have just been talking directly to the database, I think because we built them in kind of idiomatic GraphQL, about as idiomatic as you can be with GraphQL since it's so new, but since we've kind of adopted that architecture, I think scaling that over time would be so trivial compared to how you would normally have to deal with scaling an application, especially if you were doing a more RESTful architecture, or if you were doing that whole like, half REST, half ad hoc endpoints, right? Because then a lot of the time, that's going to involve, not just changing your backend layer and not just changing your like middle layer, like your API gateway, but it's also going to end up changing your front end as well. Right. And with this, like doing those performance improvements, you've really separated concerns a lot better, I think, and you end up with you're doing those performance improvements like deep in your back end, where your front end developers, and even like if you're big enough, you might have like middle layer developers, like they shouldn't be thinking about those types of things. They're much more focused. I guess the best way to put it is that the people that are focused on product and not as concerned about, what database queries are doing what, can really focus on product and iterating on that product. And then, your backend developers who are there trying to make your queries as fast as possible, they can kind of keep doing that and really kind of not have to talk to the front end developers at all. I mean, it's that I guess there's good and bad things about that, but I think by and large, that's a pretty good thing.
Yeah. So on the topic of Relay, I believe a while back you had a pull request that went into that went in there for subscriptions. Can you talk a little bit about that and
sure
what you ended up solving for your need?
Yeah. So the pull request was going into the GraphQL repo, which I'll get into why that's an important distinction. But basically, Relay right now, you can query data and you can mutate data. But, we kind of live in a real-time world, right? And where we expect that, when things change on, like when somebody changes something in their client, like it needs to live update in another client. And right now, Relay doesn't have a concept of subscriptions. So there's kind of two pieces to that. So I needed it, I wanted it. I ended up, for the most part, right now, still kind of doing like a poor man's subscription by polling. But I think that the reason why I actually started going down this road and ended up submitting that pull request to GraphQL for subscriptions was just because I wanted to use GraphQL and use Relay and get live data into my application. I mean, it's pretty simple want at the outset, but there's actually kind of far-reaching implications. So the way that my pull request works is it just was like a relatively small modification of the GraphQL language to support a subscription verb or subscription root field type, I guess is the best way to put it, and allows you to define queries just like you would to define a normal query, but by just putting basically subscription in front of it, you're indicating to the GraphQL server that you're going to want to push updates to the client based on that. So my pull request does not actually, and it did get merged, by the way. My pull request does not deal with setting up a WebSocket or any of that type of thing. It's simply adding support to the GraphQL language and to the GraphQL executor, which is the thing that actually deals with resolution and doing queries and doing mutations. It's adding support to that for subscription. So it's kind of like the building block that you need before you can build out full-fledged subscription support in Relay. And then, so what I've started on now, and this is on the Relay roadmap, is building the subscription support into Relay itself. So that's really kind of the more complex piece. Relay subscriptions, at least the implement, there's several ways that we could implement it, but the way we're kind of going after implementing it right now is kind of to model them off of Relay mutations. So you can imagine that when you perform a mutation in Relay, when you say update my user, well, that mutation is being performed, it's being the mutation starts from the client, right? The client is indicating that they want to update the user on the back end. But if you really think about it, a subscription to a query is very similar, right? It's just the opposite. It's the back end saying, hey, client, I want to mutate you, right? And, it's pushing data in. But when it all comes down to it, if you think of Relay, its main parts are it has a store that just has a bunch of basically all of your data for your application in it. And then it has, the parts, the queries and the parts that actually deal with your components actually talking to that store and requesting data and all of that, right? So to add subscriptions into Relay, it's basically like thinking about mutations but backwards, and providing. Well, there's a bunch of pieces that have to be done, but you can start by modeling it off of mutations, and then start to add. We need to add an example of how you would do this with just kind of a simple WebSocket. But we kind of the general concept behind both GraphQL and Relay is that you throw some opinions in there, but you still try to be relatively unopinionated. So if somebody wants to do the subscriptions over Socket.io or just use a plain old WebSocket without the niceties provided by Socket.io, or maybe do some type of subscription mechanism that's different altogether, Relay would still support that, but it would, the underlying mechanism by which it's updating the data in the Relay store would be kind of what's defined by Relay as the framework. But that's a work in progress. That's got a bit of work left to do. It's relatively complicated. Relay is pretty complicated underneath behind the scenes. There's a lot of stuff that it does that makes the developer experience really good from a front end developer perspective, but it makes it difficult to get a big feature add in like subscriptions.
So working with React Native as heavily as you do, does it bother you at all about the number of issues that are in the GitHub repo?
I get this question all the time. So I just recently became, along with several others, a community core member. So I can kind of help triage some of the issues and the pull requests and that
awesome.
type of thing.
Congrats.
Thanks. I'm excited because it is a huge issue. I mean, I think that it is daunting when a new person comes and looks at the React Native repo and sees that there's 889 open issues as of right now and 177 open pull requests. I think that can sometimes like cause people to worry and things. But personally, it does not worry me. I think that people don't realize right off the bat how incredibly complex React Native is. I mean, if you look at the little language graph, that displays on GitHub, there's 33% JavaScript, 28% Java, 26% Objective-C. There's 7.5% C++. There's three main languages that React Native is written in, plus a little bit of C++ for the Android JavaScript bridge. So it's not an easy thing, right, to do what the team at Facebook has done with React Native. And so having 869 open issues, it's while I hope that the number decreases over the course of time, it doesn't surprise me. And I think it's actually okay in certain ways. I mean, a lot of those issues are questions. And so we're trying to clean up some of those and, get people to move to Stack Overflow. And I think that's a common problem that a lot of people that work on large open source projects have, that people come to the issue tracker to ask questions, and maybe they're not sure if it's a bug or whatnot. So it would be, if you were actually to look at those 869 open issues and try to determine how many of them are actually bugs, I would say it's a relatively small percentage. Probably less than half at least, which is good. Some of them are really old. We need to go through and start on the last page and kind of clean up some old issues. And then I got into an interesting discussion on a pull request the other day, talking about how to whether or not certain pull requests should be accepted, and a lot of pull requests sit dormant without review and things of that nature. And the fact of the matter is that the Facebook team is really busy. And then and so let's talk prior to adding more community core team members, the Facebook team is really busy, and they answer what they can, and I think in general they do a pretty good job. But once again, React Native is a complex code base, so you can't just go accepting pull requests willy-nilly. You have to really, with the exception of super small ones, right? You have to really care about the intricacies of a pull request, and know that APIs are not going to break, and even if a change that is requested is not going to break anything, it could still add complexity or add technical debt because it may not be the most well thought out implementation. There's a lot of things to consider there that I think people just, especially in the JavaScript world, people are used to I think a great example is Redux. Redux is 90 lines or something like that. But the amount of care that was put into Redux, right, and thinking about the API, and I was I contributed a little bit to that project way at the beginning, after Dan Abramov wrote his first blog post about it, and it went through so many iterations, and that's 90 lines of code, right? Think about the amount of code that is in React Native, it's it's a daunting task to accept pull requests at all, because the changes can be so wide reaching. And so I guess my message to everyone is don't not send a pull request because you think it's never going to be accepted. It's more just understand the goals of the team and realize that the React Native team is super focused on performance. They have apps that people are building internally at Facebook that rely on React Native, so there has to be as few regressions as possible. And at Facebook, a regression to them is added 100 milliseconds to their startup time or something like that. So things that we worry about at at kind of normal scale, well, at small scale, even at normal scale, just like almost nothing is on Facebook scale, they have to worry about those things times a billion, right? And so people, I feel like, just need to understand that about the React Native issue tracker, the pull requests. I think being part of the core team over the last couple weeks, and being able to talk to a lot of the people internal at Facebook who are working on React Native and talking to them a little bit more closely, they care so much about everything when it comes to this framework. And there's just a tremendous amount of care. And so, to be honest, I would totally be willing to bet on that if there were 3,000 open issues. I think that just because they care about it as much as they do, I think is kind of a sign that it will succeed in the longer term. So I hope that we, as community team members, can go through better triage issues. I over the weekend I worked on kind of a more robust labeling system for tagging, so that it's a little bit easier to triage some of these issues. A lot of the new issues coming in are about Android, because Android is not quite at feature parity with iOS yet. And so personally, I'm not all that familiar with the Android side of the code base, but there are a lot of people at Facebook that are, and there's a few core contributors that are as well. They can help with that. So as long as we can start divvying up the work a little bit better, we'll see that number go down, and we'll see the number of pull requests go down as well. And a few of the people on the team at Facebook have also invested a lot of time in building really awesome tooling around dealing with GitHub and syncing with their internal repositories. If you've looked at pull requests at all on React Native, you see that people type at Facebook GitHub bot, ship it. And 4 hours later, things appear in GitHub. And it actually went through an automated internal review process at Facebook, and tests got ran on their internal code base. And there's all this really cool stuff that happens behind the scenes. And there's a lot of things that Facebook has to care about, because open source is so intertwined into their core that a lot of other projects don't have to worry about nearly as much. But they've invested a lot of time in that tooling. And there's more bots that Viju is writing every day. There's an ESLint bot now that will take a look at pull requests and report back any ESLint failures and flow failures and stuff like that. There's going to be probably a Reaper bot of some kind soon that can go back and take a look at older issues and ping people on them to make sure that they either get updated or closed. Some of you may have seen the blame bot that shows when a pull request is submitted who the potential best reviewers are. So these aren't just they're very cool, but they're not just things for fun. They're things that are really going to help as we dive deeper into managing the number of issues and managing the number of pull requests. They're all going to help a lot. So I don't know, managing a project at this scale is really hard. So we welcome all of the feedback that we can possibly get, and we're trying.
Also, speaking of the tagging that you guys have going on, it's actually structured extremely nice. It's fantastic, actually. And something I might want to throw out there, if anyone's trying to get into open source contribution, they have a couple of good labels that you can kind of filter. So they have all these issues, but if you want to filter them down to maybe something that's a little easier, they have a good first task label, and they also have a website label. So you can kind of go in there and do some kind of entry level stuff and kind of get your feet wet, and also help out React Native and the whole community.
Yeah, for sure. And to anyone, you don't have to be a core team member to go into issues and comment on them and try to help out. I think I've started, and same with pull requests. If people can that if there's people out there that have some familiarity with React Native, maybe been using it for a while, have dove into the internals a little bit. If anyone wants to go through and like, I've started tagging pull requests with like their size. So like if they're just small things, yeah, tag them size small. If they're like medium, meaning they need some API discussion or whatnot, they're tagged medium. And then if they're large, like, you know, something like Sebastian from the React team would submit, you know, that like changes everything ever, you know, then like I tag them appropriately. So like, but if people wanted to go in and like start helping to triage the smaller pull requests, like that would be super helpful. You know, it's just like sometimes we just can't, you know, even with the number of people that have been added to the core team, like, you know, we still all have jobs and we still have to do it all in our spare time. So, you know, any little bit of help helps.
Awesome. One last question. What are your thoughts on Dan Abramov joining the React Native tooling team?
Oh, I am very excited. I don't have any clue what he's going to be working on. I'm pretty sure that Facebook has like a 6-week orientation process, so I'm pretty sure he's still in orientation. But I really hope that that we see like React Hot Loader or something come to the React Native tooling. I think like people that are new to React Native give the packager a lot of flack. But I've actually spent kind of, I guess, unfortunately, have spent quite a bit of time looking at and working with the packager code. It's actually really well written and a really cool system. And, you know, its speed is like, I mean, it's just so much faster than like Webpack. And so like if there can be work that is kind of, you know, done by somebody like Dan, who's like has kind of deep knowledge about React internals and like understanding how that tooling works, and obviously cares a ton about developer experience, I think you know, there's a bright future ahead for that.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing what he contributes. So
yes, me too.
All right, great. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get into our picks. Kevin, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so I ran across this tool released by Google called Get Appraise, which is a distributed code review system for your Git repositories. And it's really neat because it stores the reviews in Git Notes, which is a feature inside of Git. So I've not used it yet on a project, but I'm certainly interested in that. So that's my pick.
Awesome. Adam?
So my pick is this awesome tool I've been using to manage secrets called Vault. It's written by HashiCorp, which is the same people that do Vagrant. And I had mentioned before that I like come from a Heroku background, so I'm used to like storing my app secrets and environment variables and things. Well, it turns out that like when you break away from the Heroku ecosystem, it's really not all that simple to figure out how to manage that type of like API keys and like secret information. So Vault, vaultproject.io, it's just a really awesome, really well written, really easy to use tool to manage secrets, and you can really use it for anything. It has GitHub authentication built in and all kinds of great stuff. Very cool.
Very cool. My pick is going to be another book. I've been reading The Obstacle is the Way for the second time, and I'm really liking it, and I really loved it the first time I read it. It's about stoicism, kind of, and it's kind of a book that kind of will motivate you to get through tough things in your life, whether it be in work or whether it be in your personal life or whatever, or even in programming. It's just kind of tells you to kind of push through the hard roadblocks, because when you do those things, you kind of excel. So I would really recommend that if you're looking for a good book. It's called The Obstacle is the Way, and it's written by Ryan Holiday. All right. Well, Adam, first of all, thank you so much for coming on the show. Hopefully we'll have you back again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Well, that wraps up episode 12 of React Native Radio. We look forward to seeing everyone next week.